Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Dale Wisely. We appreciate him being here very much. And he is the Director of Student Services and Community Education at Mountain Brook Schools. He's been a child and adolescent clinical psychologist for over 30 years, and he brings a lot of educational experience. He got his clinical psychology PhD and MS degree from the University of Memphis. He served a clinical internship in psychology at West Virginia University School of Medicine, and he holds a master's in theological studies from Spring Hill College. He has taught and held some adjunct faculty positions at UAB, at the University of Alabama, and Spring Hill College. And he's also the past president of the Alabama Psychological Association, and he's received several distinguished service awards in that capacity. He is a regular and popular adult speaker on parenting and family issues such as what we're talking about here this evening. And I appreciate him coming, and it's an honor and privilege to have you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Really wasn't nervous till I got here and saw the crowd. There's people standing in the back, 2 or 3 TV stations. I think I spotted Wolf Blitzer loitering outside. So. Congratulations for having this number of people in our community. I live in Vestavia Hills, and so I'm proud to see this, as I know you are. We have been fighting this battle for a long time in the Mountain Brook School District where I work. And sometimes we struggle to get people to come out. This is very encouraging. I hope you'll continue. The only thing that we really know that gives us the best shot at trying to combat these problems is a broad-based community effort that's sustained over time. You have to keep it up. You have to keep going. And from time to time, if you do have low numbers, you keep going. I always tell people unlike tonight, when you do have smaller crowds, you have to think about everybody being kind of deputized, to go out and spread the word to their friends. And so it's a very encouraging thing to have so many people here. I want to focus on my personal interest in all this and professional interest, which is to talk about the prevention piece and the response piece. What can we do at the level of the family? If you're like things are at Mountain Brook, sometimes we have a tendency in the community to say, what's school going to do? What's somebody else going to do about this? And again, a community effort means everybody plays a part. The schools will always play an important part, as they do in my school district. But we also believe very much in empowering parents to do what they can just to be aware. Let me say a couple things to start. And I chose this little diagram, this picture on purpose. It's impossible to think when you're raising kids at this age that you could be facing this thing down the road. We think about that a lot in Mountain Brook and elsewhere. We have numbers in Mountain Brook. By the time our high school students leave us, 75% or so will tell us on anonymous surveys that they're drinking. 50% will describe themselves as regular drinkers. And when you walk into a classroom, as I did today, and you look at first graders, it's hard to imagine 3/4 of them will be drinkers and half of them will be pretty significant drinkers by the time they leave us. It's impossible to think that way. It's very difficult. So we have to keep this focus, and we have to remember this is the time to start talking about it, to start looking for opportunities. And Lord knows there's an abundance of opportunities to raise this question. We had one last week with the tragic death of a very public figure, Robin Williams. We have celebrities who are in trouble all the time. So there's endless opportunities to talk to our kids about it. A tip for you after 32 years of being a family psychologist. By the way, I just came back this weekend from my 40th high school reunion. I'm still a little weirded out by that. My friend Dickie Barlow, my boss, the superintendent over at Mountain Brook, said I needed to be prepared to walk into a room full of old people, and that's exactly what happened. Somehow I just didn't imagine that would happen. But a little tip about, just a very practical tip about talking to your kids about sensitive things like drugs and alcohol. Probably the worst way to do that for most of us is to sit down one Tuesday night at the dining room table, have the talk. A couple of problems with that. If you've ever tried it that way, you know the kind of reaction you get. You get a lot of eye rolling, get a lot of discounting. You're trying to cram a lot of information in a short time. It's overwhelming for people. And there's all that, as a friend of mine said, all that creepy eye contact. So an alternate way to do that, and I'm really not kidding, is in my sort of private vocabulary, I refer to as talking about it on the way to Target. Get your kid in the car with you and ride off to Target or someplace, doesn't matter where, ride someplace. You've eliminated the creepy eye factor, eye contact factor, and just sometimes conversations flow better in that kind of context. So look for opportunities, plenty of them, and don't rely on the talk. It's kind of like sex education talks. Try to jam all that in one evening with a 14-year-old, they'll totally freak out for good reason, start running away from you. Talk about the things that kill our teenagers. I'm interested, I spent 15 years working at Children's Hospital, learning the psychology department, and for most of my career, my office was literally next door to the old emergency department. So that's how I got interested in things that kill teenagers. So let's look at the list. This is in Alabama. This is for ages 15 to 24. Top causes of death, more or less in order. And by far the first is motor vehicle accidents. I have an interest in that. I do talks. I do talks every year here at your Board of Education on teen driving. I do it 3 or 4 times in Mountain Brook and travel around doing it. Motor vehicle accidents by far is the #1 killer of teenagers by far. Depending on the neighborhood, quite literally true, number 2 will either be suicide or homicide. Suicide among young people is the second cause of death, certainly in affluent and mostly white neighborhoods. Homicide is the #2 cause of death in African American poor communities of various kinds. So those kind of play tag team for number 2 and 3. And then we have unintentional poisoning. And the majority of unintentional poisoning cases are the accidental ingestion of drugs, the very kind of thing we've been talking about tonight with opiates and opioids. Not all, but most of those poisonings are related to drug use. And then the 5th cause are all the other accidents, things like drownings and so forth. So if you looked at the direct impact, the direct drug use as the direct cause of death, it's not that highly ranked. But then I ask you to look at that list and tell me how many of those things that kill teenagers are very much influenced by alcohol and drugs. How many of them? All of them. Motor vehicle accidents, obviously a great complication and driving force, no pun intended, where those accidents is alcohol and drugs. Suicide. Suicide has contributions from substance abuse, not always, but very often in a couple of ways. One is that people are often under the direct influence of substances, maybe just alcohol, maybe something else, when they attempt suicide or in fact die by suicide. And another way suicide is impacted by drug abuse is that over time, when someone is an addict, and particularly if they're unable to beat that addiction, it increases their risk of suicide as they go through that process. The law enforcement people in the room can tell you that there's a very close connection between substance abuse and homicide. And there are many other kinds of things we could talk about in that context. I've already mentioned poisoning. Other accidents like people drowning at the lake, sort of recreational drownings and falls and things, are greatly influenced by substance abuse. So all that is a long way of saying I think you can make the case that directly or indirectly, alcohol and drugs are the #1 killer of our youth. If you're going to lose someone, as you have, and as we have in our community, in a given year, the most likely reason is going to be directly or indirectly substance abuse. I believe that's fair to say. Also want to say that, before I go further with this, that we'll talk about this again. It's already been mentioned. No one is immune. No one is immune. And I think later I'll talk about a couple of examples, including one we've already heard, about how the kind of folks we normally think of as just good and solid and decent people can end up in really serious trouble with drug addiction. I also want to say something about the role at the beginning of the role of mental health disorders. It's very well known among clinicians, I think well known among law enforcement folks, that there's very often a connection between substance abuse and psychiatric problems. And I think, again, the Robin Williams story is a great example of that from what I know from the press. And I'll just mention one thing. Of all the things that were said and written last week about that particular tragedy, there's one that has stuck with me. I just ran across it randomly, I think in social media someplace. And that was somebody who said that when someone dies by suicide or they die from an addiction, that we often use the language of losing. They lost their battle. They lost their battle with depression. They lost their battle with substance abuse or with addiction. And this person said, these people are not losers. They're just terrible diseases. Terrible diseases that none of us, again, is immune to. Let's talk about an incomplete list of some of the drugs we're always worried about. And I am going to talk about alcohol. I'm going to talk about it a good bit, actually, in a moment. That's always there. And just as likely as any of these drugs to take out one of your teenagers this academic year. There is no comfort for a parent that should be taken in saying it's just alcohol. Alcohol kills people deader than anything. Kills teenagers in large numbers, kills adults in large numbers. And we'll cover that in a little bit. Marijuana is always out there. Prescription medication, I'm so glad we've had some focus on that. I'm going to skip the part about opiates and painkillers, except for one quick story in a minute. But the others that we often see trouble with are the stimulant medications that are often prescribed for ADHD. And let me quickly add, as somebody who's taken care of many, many children with ADHD in my career as a psychologist, that the irony of that is people who actually have ADHD don't often abuse their medication or don't become addicted to their medication. Typically, the people who abuse stimulant medications are people who do not have ADHD. Anti-anxiety medications like Xanax and Klonopin are widely abused, and of course, prescription pain medicines. I'm going to tell an embarrassing story about myself in the service of maybe being helpful to you. It really is embarrassing. Should have known better. Some years ago, I don't know how long it's been, we raised 3 daughters. And some years ago, I just went about the business of cleaning out a medicine cabinet. You know how you do that occasionally. And realized that over several years, we had accumulated, I had about 90 Lortabs on hand in my house. I just didn't realize it. The usual kind of thing, somebody go to the emergency room and get prescribed Lortabs and maybe take one or maybe not take any and put it in the medicine cabinet and not even think about it again. And then somebody got a dry socket. There's another, so I was profoundly embarrassed, especially when you think about all the kids who had been through my house to spend the night, right? So they're up in the medicine cabinet someplace, and somebody spends the night at your house, and they get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, go in, pop the medicine cabinet, take a quick scan of what's in there, and take out whatever they want, and probably wouldn't, I don't know that I would have missed it. And again, I'm not proud of that story. I'm kind of embarrassed. But I want to tell that story as a reminder that we have to be more mindful of how we deal with these things in our homes. All of us do. Lots of interest right now in these sort of bizarre synthetic marijuana things, spice and bath salts. Basically, stuff that's until fairly recently, what was it, 2011 or something, were not regulated, were not illegal. Lethy materials soaked with all kinds of weird chemicals. The biggest problem with those being people just never know what they're getting. It's not a particular uniform active drug that's in all of those. It's a big mixture of very strange things. And so I think to this day they're fairly poorly understood. But there's certainly multiple cases of people dying as a result of ingesting those things. And then, of course, I would mention heroin. I think this has also been, I will admit, quite a revelation for me. There's been lots of talk in the last several years about heroin over the mountain. And I think I have to admit that probably until fairly recently, kind of in the back of my mind, if I knew somebody was involved in heroin, I tended to think of sort of a career recreational drug user, just somebody who just kind of thrown everything away a long time ago, and at some point they just say, hey, gee, I think I'll try heroin today, and you kind of wonder why in the world they'd do that. I think we all know now there's a very different story behind heroin. It's often the story of, as it was used as the name of a recent program at UAB about this, pills to needles, all right? An addiction to a narcotic that progresses to the point that it actually may be cheaper to use heroin. It may be easier to get it because you've kind of run out of resources in terms of talking to the medical doctors and so forth. And so there's a progression to heroin that's particularly scary. And of course, once people are there, it's very difficult to turn back. When Philip Seymour Hoffman died, I remember hearing several experts commenting that once somebody is involved in IV narcotics, they're just not going to survive to be middle-aged. I want to just challenge you about this one. Is alcohol the worst drug on the planet? And everybody in the room wants to say no, and I understand that. And of course, like all other questions, it depends on how you ask the question. There's a way you can ask this question or think about the answer to this question where I think the answer may be yes. Are there drugs that we could go out tonight after the meeting and do that would be more dangerous than alcohol? Maybe. Sure. I think we can all think of things like that. If the question though means if you kind of back up and you look at the big picture and you look at the whole planet and you ask yourself what drug that people abuse causes the most misery and pain and destruction to the most people, I think it's probably alcohol. The only contender for that might be tobacco, by the way, which kills about 6 million people a year and is responsible for maybe 1 out of 10 deaths. It's the ultimate irony that somehow we've ended up with the maybe two biggest killers being the two that are legal. It's the oddest thing when you think about it. I often challenge people along this way. If we never had alcohol, let's say alcohol didn't exist. And of course, it always has because it exists by, fermentation of carbohydrates. So if we didn't have alcohol, and in 2014 it got invented in some lab in Mexico and got released on the street, and people started noticing how rapidly it works, how quickly it gets in your bloodstream, and quickly start to notice how much it contributes to child abuse and domestic violence and motor vehicle accidents and lost productivity and yada, yada. There's no way it'd be legal. Absolutely no way. If it was invented as a new drug, exactly as it is now, in 2014, I guarantee it'd be illegal. So it's just an accident of history and biology and that we ended up with alcohol, which destroys a lot of lives. Next. It's a major or direct contributor, certainly contributing factor in the death of lots and lots of kids, lots of injuries. About 5,000 people a year, young people a year, die as a result of underage drinking. Next. Thank you. Binge drinking. This is usually defined in terms of about 5 drinks in one sitting on one occasion. And the really scary thing about young drinkers, underage drinking, this is also true of college drinking, by the way, is when a young person identifies themselves as a drinker, they're almost always a binge drinker. Binge drinking is just a part of underage drinking. The idea of a teenager who just will occasionally have a beer at a party or something is really fairly uncommon. Binge drinking is the norm among young people. And of course, binge drinking is what's acutely deadly about alcohol. And so a long way of saying that it's not a way we can take comfort in knowing our kids are just abusing alcohol and not abusing other drugs. A couple of other things to consider about alcohol is the impact it has on adolescent brain development. Later this year, I'm going to do a talk on misunderstanding the teenage brain, which is a whole other topic. But we now know, of course, that the brain is developing much later than we used to think. It's probably not into the mid-20s before the brain stops cooking. And during the time it's in development, it's particularly sensitive to the introduction of any number of chemicals and drugs, including probably marijuana and absolutely alcohol. So from a health point of view, there's simply no question that the best approach for parents to support is a no alcohol approach for their young people with developing brains, and we'll say more about that a little bit later. And by the way, if it's true that the brain's not fully developed until the mid-20s, this has implications for young adults, and even in the legal college age type drinking beyond 21, there are brain implications for that that simply aren't the same as they would be for people my age or the age of many people in this room. So didn't mean to be presumptuous, but some of you look like you're in my cohort, so to speak. Next. 5 things that parents believe that are just flat wrong. And I want to go through these with you as, again, a way of just kind of challenge your thinking about this. First one is, I'm going to supervise their drinking. I'm going to take their keys and let them drink in a safe environment. And by the way, we have an expression we use in Mountain Brook. I think I coined this phrase, and that is the lake effect. I borrowed the term from meteorology, right? It has nothing to do with the weather. The lake effect is parents who, when they're in Vestavia Hills, working their jobs and just, the usual kind of week, same in Mountain Brook, they might have really good sense and really good practices about watching their kids and monitoring their kids. Then they go off to the lake or go off to the beach or go off to the ski resort, and all the rules kind of get loose. Oh, it's vacation time. Everybody just kind of relaxes, and the kids kind of have more run of things and, go over to this beach house or this lake house for a little party and this and that. You don't quite know where your kids are the way you would when they're at home, and so that just leaves it open for all kinds of exploration and abuse that you don't really think about. The lake effect, we call that. So if you supervise your kids drinking, you decide, well, I want them to drink in my home so they'll be safe. So just a couple of things to consider. One thing is what message we're sending when we do that. One message is it's perfectly okay with me if you break the law. Laws are something to be disregarded, which I think is generally a pretty unhealthy message. Remember, each and every incident of a child drinking before 21 is illegal in all 50 states, and I'm not sure what message we convey when we allow our kids to, or supervise their drinking. I don't know what responsible teenage drinking looks like, to be honest, particularly when it's legal. I've never seen it, never seen responsible teenage drinking. And I think also importantly, the research is very clear that parental tolerance of underage drinking leads to more drinking and not less drinking. And I'll cover that again in just a minute because I think it's particularly important. Next. Sorry about the change in slides here. I popped this in from another presentation. Heard this one before? I love this one. Young people in Europe drink more responsibly because it's relaxed and there's permissive alcohol use in the context of family and people have wine together, dinner and everything. So it allows them to learn to drink responsibly at a younger age. Or you'll hear the flip side of that, which is our United States punitive approach to underage drinking makes it go undercover and it becomes forbidden fruit that encourages alcohol use. Let's look at some data next. Just quickly, this is kind of an international study of underage drinking among youth. And this is the heavy drinking in the past 30 days among youth in different countries. All the European countries, at least the ones I can pronounce and spell. And then the last one there is the United States. So the only country that was surveyed in this particular study that had less heavy drinking in the United States was Turkey. And I think every other, as you can see, some of the other European countries just tower over us in terms of the amount of teenage drinking. So this idea that it's a good idea to supervise and teach kids how to drink is not really supported by the research. And then here's another one. They're going to drink anyway, so since they're going to drink anyway, we'll do this, we'll let them enjoy beer at the lake, we'll do this, we'll supervise, take everybody's keys, whatever it is. And it's just not true. It's just not true. Now, your teenagers will tell you that everybody drinks at Vestavia High School. It's not true. We hear the same thing in Mount Brook, and we have too much. We have, by the time our kids leave us, we have more alcohol abuse at Mount Brook High School than we do at the state level or the national level. So we're very clear about our dirty laundry. But that does not translate into every student in the school drinking. So that's just kind of a fatalistic sort of myth. Everybody drinks, so we just got to deal with it. And I just think that's just flatly not true. Every survey says there's at least a substantial minority of kids, even among high school seniors, that stay away from alcohol. Next, I drank in high school, and I turned out just fine. And my response to that is usually, oh, did you really? That's my first response. My second response to that, because I know some of these people who say that, and they didn't turn out all that well. And I'm actually licensed in the state of Alabama to say that as a psychologist. And the second thing is, only the people who are alive to say it, right? Only the people who are not in jail, other than people who haven't had their life just kind of deteriorate to some low point they can't get back from. So it's only people who can stand up straight in Mountain Brook, Alabama, Vestavia, that can say that they survived that. Nobody ever said that drinking when you're in high school means it's inevitable you're going to die from it. I never said that. It's about risk, about the risk, and the risks are really very high. Sure, people survive it, but we lose too many, one way or the other, who don't survive the experience. They need to practice drinking before they go to college. It just drives me crazy. We're not talking about learning to play the clarinet here. The idea that sort of practicing it early, I don't really know what people are talking about. Because again, the evidence would point to something pretty different from that. And that is, I think I'll say this again, but maybe 3 times is too many. Supervised drinking leads to more unsupervised drinking, not less. That's the take-home point on this whole idea of teaching them how to drink and letting them practice so they get really, really good at it before they go off to college. I've got a little bit of an attitude about this, you might have noticed. Okay. And then again, at least it's not drugs. Well, first of all, alcohol is a drug. I think culturally we don't want to say that, but from any sensible clinical perspective, what it does to a person, like causes them to be like intoxicated, it's addicting for a substantial number of people who try it. Not everybody, but a substantial number of people who try it. So certainly alcohol is a drug. It's just a more generally socially acceptable drug. And, it's hard to name another drug, as I said earlier, that's done that much damage to this number of people, unless it's tobacco. That might be the only contender for it. It's often lethal in essentially a single episode. That's what alcohol intoxication, or alcohol poisoning, not intoxication. Alcohol poisoning, as you know, is often lethal. Shuts down the respiratory system. Person dies very often from asphyxiation. Just a reminder, no one's immune. No family's immune. I have 3 daughters. I have 2 grandkids. I will not stand up here and conclude that we're out of the woods. I won't conclude that I'm out of the woods. I won't conclude that my wife's out of the woods. We don't get out of the woods when it comes to addiction. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you often get addiction following legitimate treatment of some problem, most commonly pain. And then the other way is you develop a psychiatric illness. We're not out of the woods on that, right? Major depression, people get anxiety disorders. Sometimes the treatment they get is inadequate. It's hard to access psychiatric treatment sometimes, or psychological treatment. And so people self-medicate. So you have this very interesting sort of circular relationship between mental health disorders. So that's one way that good people can kind of back into substance abuse, is by way of developing a mental health disorder. So what do we know? We know that there's no one thing or no group of things that parents can do that will guarantee this won't happen. I'd love to tell you, nobody knows. Nobody knows a pattern that you can follow at home in raising your kids and raise your family, guarantee they won't get in trouble. What we can talk about is what the research tells us about ways that families can reduce the risk. That's all we can really hope to do, is to reduce the risk and hope for a good outcome. So that's what some of the things I want to cover in the remaining time that we have. What does the research tell us? All right. Here we go, yeah. Kids, when teenagers get into the teenage years, there's a thing that always happens, which is and it's supposed to happen. If it doesn't happen, there's something wrong. and that is the teenagers begin to shift their focus from being primarily on their parents and their families to being more and more interested in what's going on with their peers. This is not a big surprise. It's a very normal process. But sometimes parents, misinterpret that as meaning that once their teenagers become teenagers, the parents' influence on their lives is no longer important, and that's not true. Teenagers tell us in study after study that they want to know what their parents believe. They want to know what their parents think. They want to know what their parents' expectations are. They want clarity about that. And we owe that to them. We owe them that kind of clarity. Now, what would be wrong with saying this to a teenager, which, by the way, is what we said to all three of our daughters? Alcohol is illegal in the state of Alabama, honey. So our expectation as a family is that you won't drink because it's against the law and it's bad for your health, and we're in charge of it, and we made a decision that you may not drink not one drop until it's legal to do so. Where did we give up that ground? Exactly when did we give up that ground? Now, we added this when we said it to our daughters. We added this. We said, just because we declared this, we're not naive enough to think that means you won't drink. If you do, and we learn about it, we're going to deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to throw you in prison or in a rehab facility. It means that if it's a health problem, we're going to deal with the health problem. If you did it and there's no health problem, you just did it, we're going to deal with it as a disciplinary issue. But we're not going to turn our backs on it. We're not going to shrug and say kids will be kids. We're not going to shrug and say everybody in Vestavia Mountain Brook drinks when they're teenagers, because it's not true. And furthermore, even if it was true, we wouldn't care. Because my job is to raise my daughters and not to care what everybody else is doing. All right? I was just hoping not to get thrown out. That was really kind of a nice bonus to get. Thank you. All right, so what are some good practices if we're adults and we're trying to take care of this? One is to make our rules very clear, and I just modeled for you one way you might consider doing that. But the main thing is don't shrug it off, have the conversations over and over again. When my daughters left the house, invariably, we'd turn them around by their shoulders and make eye contact with them, and just before we kissed them on the forehead or cheek, we'd say, no alcohol and drugs. And we went through a little list of things, we'd go through. And obviously get to the point they're rolling their eyes. That's not my problem. My problem is to make sure I consistently remind them of that message, that I haven't at some point decided they were old enough that I didn't have to say it anymore. One of them's 32, I pretty much quit saying it. I don't have any control over it anymore. Clear rules, and I really do believe the best approach parents can take on this, the safest approach, the one that's best supported by the research, is a no-use policy, including alcohol. I really believe it, and I've been looking at this stuff for a long, long time. Another is consistent consequences. It doesn't necessarily mean punishment. Could mean consultation with a professional. It could be any number of things, but not ignoring it. There's always going to be consequences to it if you learn about it. And then loving support. And I'll say this at the end, but it bears repeating. We've got good research now to tell us that the family environment that's most likely to discourage alcohol and drug use is one characterized by a combination of two things. Loving support. That's the sweet stuff. That's the looking at the child and talking about how special they are and how much you love them. That stuff is important. But it's got to be combined with clear rules and consequences and some consistency. Those two things together make for the most powerful family environment to stay away from this kind of stuff. What about parental patterns? This is a very familiar problem to me. I get accused with regularity in Mountain Brook. Dr. Wise is going around saying parents shouldn't drink or shouldn't let their kids know they're drinking. Never said it once because I don't believe it. I do think that parents need to consider their substance use behavior and the messages they convey to kids. So, sticking with alcohol for a minute, Well, let's do pills first. In a household where people take a lot of pills, maybe even perfectly legal prescribed pills, taking them as prescribed. When kids grow up in a culture where people quickly turn to pills when they're uncomfortable, we have to believe that might have an impact. Switch to alcohol. When I say that I don't think it's about whether parents drink or not, it's about the pattern of drinking. It's really what I'm talking about. And I've usually illustrated it this way. Let's say that you come home from, let's say that you're preparing dinner, and while you're preparing dinner, there are kids moving around in the kitchen, and you've got a glass of wine on the counter, and you occasionally sip from the glass of wine while you're stir frying or whatever. I have no reason to think that's a bad idea. That's up to you and your family's decision making. Got no evidence that that kind of responsible use of alcohol is a problem for kids to see. How about, on the other hand, somebody comes home from work and they walk through the front door kind of fussing about the job and how awful things are, nobody understands them, nobody else will pull their weight at the office, and the first thing the parent does is make a beeline for the bar, pours a big one, drinks it, slumps down in the lazy boy and goes, that's a very different message. You got two different ways of a single drink with very different messages in what people convey. Another challenge I like to offer, this usually goes over like a lead balloon in Mountain Brook, is how often do you have a social event at your home with adults where there's no alcohol? And in Mountain Brook, I don't know about you guys, in Mountain Brook that doesn't happen much. Now, it's unthinkable to watch a football game without a constant flow of alcohol or have any kind of social event. I think the adult cultural attitudes have a big impact on all this. 2011 study, adult supervised alcohol use among youth resulted in higher levels of harmful alcohol consequences among youth. Next, think about the pattern. What is the message you're trying to convey? Or maybe not trying to convey, but you are conveying with your patterns of use in the home. Another one I get a lot is, how do you handle the dreaded question? You know what the dreaded question is? Mom, did you drink in high school? Dad, did you smoke pot in high school? And for those of you who did, careful choice of pronoun there, that could be a hard one to know how to respond to. And so just a couple of tips. What are your options? Let's say you did. Let's say you drank. Let's say you drank a lot in high school. Let's say you did drugs in high school. There's a couple things you could do. You could lie, of course. You could say, nope, no, I didn't. And then, when your brother Larry visits from Denver, you're busted, right? So that may not be the approach. Now, you could say, I did, and then you start talking about, oh, yeah, I remember this time we went to the lake, we all just got plowed up drunk, and we, stole a boat, went around, and you could do that kind of thing. Or you could say this. You could decide not to answer, but if you say, I'm not going to answer that question, you've answered the question. So another approach is to answer the question at least partly. Yeah, I did some things in high school. I did some drinking. I did occasionally experiment with drugs. In retrospect, I really wish I hadn't. But here's the main tip. Do not let that become the focus of the conversation. That's the game. Let's get mom and dad talking about their use, and then they're able to say to you, where do you get off telling me what I can do since you did it when you were in high school? And you get the answer, I get off by doing it by being bigger and smarter, and you're a parent, and I've got more power and more energy and more insurance, and and I've got the power to make your life miserable if you play around with that stuff, and if you do play around with it, I will exercise that right. You do it by being an authority, by being kind and clear and supportive, but that your history just is not what's at issue here. I've made all kinds of mistakes in my life that I hope my kids will avoid. So the main trick on that is just don't get caught up. Don't get caught into that trap of once you've made the confession, you've lost your moral authority, because you haven't. By the same token, if it's true, you never played around with anything, you never drank in high school, and you never did drugs, then your kids are going to say, hey, you don't get to tell me anything because you never tried it. So you can't win. So you just don't let that become the focus of the conversation. So let's just kind of end with a few last things. What can we do? First step we've already taken. You're here. You're here in large numbers, and that's we've got to educate ourselves. And so as the year goes on and the years passes, I hope we continue to have programs to learn about different aspects of these difficulties. You have to know the facts, and I frankly think it's particularly important to avoid scare tactics. It's a bad idea to exaggerate the truth. You don't have to. The truth is bad enough, right? If you say to your kids, if you smoke a joint, you're going to have children with terrible deformities. Your kid will find out in 5 minutes on Google that you're lying to them. So we have a responsibility to learn the truth. The truth is bad enough. You don't have to make up things that are worse than they really are. So that's an approach to consider. Talk about it often. Talk about it early. Look for those natural opportunities to bring it up, which are in abundance in our culture. Again, just last week we had an example. I do believe the safest approach is a no-use approach. And I know that's particularly when it comes to alcohol, a fairly radical idea, although frankly, I don't know how it became such a radical idea, but it did at some point. We have to consider what it is that we are modeling, and that's a big challenge to us, is to pay attention to our own behavior and think about what is the message that I'm communicating with my own use. And that thing of I'm an adult and you're a child can be valid, but it only goes so far. If kids grow up in an environment where alcohol is de rigueur in anything social, then what else are they going to have except that attitude as soon as they're able to drink? People have alcohol when they have fun and when they get together, and when that's what's taught in schools, how can they avoid feeling that way? Years ago, there was a public service announcement that ran on TV, like in the early 70s or late 60s, that was, it's 10 o'clock and you know where your kids are. This has become, this is still a pretty good idea, right? The whole thing about accountability, which has become more difficult in some ways and easier in other ways because of cell phones. All right, so the cell phone thing is, as long as they can reach me, and as long as I can reach them by cell phone, then that gives us some level of comfort with parents as we get really loose about curfews. As long as I can call them, they can call me, let me know if they're in trouble, then we start feeling more confident or more comfortable than being out at crazy hours, and I think that's not good. Another approach we could take is to remind ourselves that we have no legal or moral obligation to provide our children an iPhone, believe it or not. We really don't. And if we do, and if we're paying the bills, part of that sort of contract, maybe even literally a contract, I've got one for you if you want one, could be that you have to have GPS activated and you have to friend me on Find My Friends, and I want to be able to know where you are. Don't use the iPhone as a form of trickery to get away with all kinds of things. So it's been really kind of a double-edged sword, the whole cell phone thing for us. We have to help our teens discover and develop strategies for getting out of high-pressure situations. I'm going to end with a quick story. I think I'm almost done. Quick story. People, for some reason, love this story, but when one of my daughters probably was about 15, and she wanted to come to a party and go to a party in Mountain Brook. And as I said, we live in Vestavia Hills. I was not feeling great about it, but I was kind of having that attitude of, oh, you know, she's getting older. Why do I have to be Dr. Danger all the time? Maybe I need to relax a little bit. So I drive her to the party, and as soon as I drive up to this house in Mountain Brook, birthday party, I'm not happy. The front yard is dark. There's, you know, about as many people there on the front yard as are here tonight in the dark. There's a band playing. Everybody's got red Solo cups happening. I'm not liking this. So what I probably should have done is just driven off, but about the time I was going to drive off, all of my daughter's friends converged on the car and greeted my daughter while she's still in the car. I thought, well, I'm about to humiliate her by driving away. So instead, I kind of turned to her, and I did about 3 years of lectures in about 3 seconds, you know. Don't do that, but I do that, but she's like, oh, okay, right. So she gets out of the car, and she goes into the party, and to this day, she doesn't know this. I just went to her graduation with her master's degree last week. She still doesn't know this. I never got more than a block and a half away. Went down the block, turned right, pulled over to the curb. I keep a book in my car, so I'm just there in the neighborhood. And about 15 minutes later, she calls me on my cell phone, and she says, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know you're already home. No, I wouldn't. It's just a half block. She said, I've got a migraine, so could you come get me? I said, sure. So, and then she said, could you get me like a half a block down the road? So I said, sure. So I go the half block down the road. She gets in the car, and we go home, and I don't ask her any questions, and she doesn't offer anything. My daughter doesn't have migraines. I have a migraine was code language in the Wisely family for I'm in a situation which is kind of hinky, and I don't want to get embarrassed. Could you get me out of this? So we had prearranged that. And so those kind of strategies, when you think about it, asking a teenager to walk away from a social thing where something they're not quite comfortable with is happening is a tall order. It's a lot to ask. So you have to help them with that by developing some kind of strategy to help them get out of those kind of situations. Last couple things. Don't sanction, don't allow passively or actively any kind of illegal activity, underage drinking, gatherings at your house. Provide adequate supervision. Big problem in Mountain Brook where sometimes the party's going over in the second floor of the East Wing and the parents are sleeping in the West Wing. But it's something we need to provide more supervision than we typically do. Let's go back to curfews. They make sense. They're safe. They contribute to good behavior. And don't be willing to negotiate too much just because somebody has a cell phone. Let's be clear about our expectations. And then let's network with each other. It requires a lot of moral courage. So when your daughter says, I'm going over to Renee's house, we're going to spend the night, and there's going to be a couple other people there, and yes, the parent's going to be there, what do? We call those parents. And when you say to your young person, I have to call Mrs. So-and-so to find out that's true, and just kind of watch the color drain from her face, then you know you're on to something. We need to network. We need to put our kids in a situation where they can no longer say, Mrs. Jones allows this, or Dr. Jones allows this, or so-and-so. And again, even if we believe other parents are being more lenient than we are, our position needs to be, we just don't care. So join me in this last chant about not caring what other people do. We just don't care. Come on. We just don't care. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and God bless.